Hey everyone, happy Thursday. Welcome to So What, the Marketing Analytics and Insights live show. I'm Katie. I'm joined by John. Chris is actually doing a LinkedIn Live session today. So, John and I today are talking about podcast advertising and some of the best practices. So, one of the reasons why we feel very comfortable talking about this is because Chris and John host Marketing Over Coffee, what do we say, the longest running marketing podcast in the history of the world. Is that
the
is
most
that accurate,
ancient,
John?
the most ancient podcast in all of the realms.
How does it make you feel when people talk about it that way? Like, is that a weird thing to wrap your head around? Like that you and Chris have been podcasting every single week for the past 13 years.
Yeah, it is definitely weird because it's just so old, especially in marketing, because we're always joking about the pioneers. You know, you talk about the pioneers. Well, the pioneers are the ones that you find on the side of the trail with the arrows in their back. You know, that's what a pioneer ends up doing. And yet, for some reason, we've just continued to do it. All the way through. We outlasted the chasm. You know, normally the early adopters do their thing, and that's what happened. It was so hot around 2008 or whatever, and it took another 5 years before the rest of the world was kind of like, oh, that's what the nerds are talking about. And so yeah, it's been one long crazy road, but we still love doing it, so I can't beat that.
How does it make you feel every time you sort of see the resurgence where people like podcasting, it's the new big thing? You're like, really?
Yeah, it just happens, and I just get excited about it because every time it happens, like the huge one was when Serial broke on the scene. That must be getting around 5 or 6 years ago now, even.
I think so, yeah.
But like that true crime thing got on, and then that was just nuts. That brought literally millions of people in. I mean, up to that point, it was like a cool tech podcast would do like 500,000 downloads in a month. And then Serial came along and did I think like the second season, they did like 2 million the first week or something. You know, it just completely changed the landscape. And so many people fell in love with it that, yeah, our numbers, have kind of been on this organic uprise the whole time. And we just keep doing what we're doing. We don't have to do any extra work. The rest of the world is just starting to show up.
So today we want to talk about podcast advertising. So the couple of things that we want to talk about specifically are the biggest mistakes that advertisers make and also the most common mistakes that a podcast host can make. So where do you want to start, John? Do you want to start with the advertisers or the hosts?
Yeah, well, we definitely start with the advertisers, and even we can take a little step back on that too, because before that even is the question of like, should you be advertising on a podcast? Is that what you want to do? Because a lot of companies will come out of the gate and say, well, why don't we make our own podcast? Like, we can do this. And over the years, what we've seen is that's just such a mistake, right? For the majority of companies, podcasting is not relevant to what they're doing. And just because you can do it for free, it's just like a website or a blog. You're like, yeah, we can do this for free. Well, no, you can make a bad one for free, but to make a great one, you need to put some money and resources and time behind it. And so in that first choice, why would you build your own when, after you build your own, you're going to have to push it to your own audience. You're going to send it to the house list. That's going to be your first drop. Whereas if you sponsor a podcast, you immediately get access to a whole new group of people, a whole new universe of contacts. And then the other one is just as far as internally is where you're putting the resources. Because, before you start up that podcast, take a look and, well, is our blog doing as well as it could be doing? Because you could put the same effort towards your blog, and Google, the tech has come a long way now. When I would say this 5 years ago, you'd be an idiot to podcast before your blog was optimized, because Google just did so much more with the text blog. It could read, scan, and index all that content, and you could get SEO lift, whereas Google would just see an audio file sitting there and wouldn't even know what to do with it. And then even video too, with all of the Google juice and the strength of YouTube as its own platform, doing video would really come ahead of doing just pure audio on its own. So, between, are you getting the most out of your other channels before you start running down this path? It's just advertising makes more sense. Now, the one exception to that, though, is, of course, if your company is doing something audio related. So the best example that I have is Shure, the microphone company, SHURE. They'll do podcasts and put out content of people using their microphones and their audio gear. And that's just a home run, because I see Dan and Shay recording just in some weird hall with a mic that they plug into their iPhone and it sounds fantastic. I'm going to run out and buy the thing to play with it. So yeah, I know that's a kind of a good place to start is first, like, what do you want to accomplish? And are you better off, just throwing some money towards ads or trying to build your own thing? But that's kind of before I'm running on too long and too wide. Does that all make sense there?
No, it does make sense because, as we've been sort of half-heartedly joking over previous episodes, like, oh, podcasting is back, but you and Chris have been doing it forever. Especially with the pandemic, I feel like it was a great time to start a podcast. It was a great time to start, a video live stream, whatever the thing was. But not everyone has something to say. Not everyone has something useful to say. And so in your example, when companies are trying to figure out, should I advertise or should I start my own? The first question you have to ask is, what do I have to say? What do I have to offer to the audience? And am I better off just, slapping my name on someone else's podcast? And I think, you can apply that thinking to events as well. Do I need to have a booth at the event, or do I want to just sponsor a booth at an event or something along those lines?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's the same deal with events. It's like, you don't need to, you just have to have a presence there. And it's okay if you ride along on somebody else's infrastructure. You don't have to build the infrastructure yourself.
Do you think it's a better idea, even if you're thinking about starting a podcast, to start off like for your company, not for your personal, but if you have a company and you're thinking about starting a podcast, should you test the waters with advertising to see if you even really have an audience who's interested in your company? Like, what's the best way to go about thinking through, like, should I start my own or should I just sponsor other people's?
Yeah, well, I think it's really more about that. Do you have something unique to say that makes it attractive? Well, there's a couple different ways to go, because one thing that we don't see enough of, which I think is huge, is the idea of internal podcasts or super focused audience podcasts. I mean, you could even do a company internal podcast where you're talking about just where we're going and what's going on this week. And people can listen to that in off hours or, while they're exercising or whatever. So it's a great way to get stuff out there that people can use. But, testing the waters is always kind of a challenge. The one thing with testing the waters is there's confirmation bias, right? Because odds are you're going to make some kind of limited podcast. You're probably not going to promote it well. So it's just going to go to your existing audience and the folks that already love podcasting. So they actually will probably tell you that, they do like it unless it's terrible. So it's not really testing where to go. Another thing you could do is you could even run ads and say, hey, sign up for our podcast when it's released, because just so you can get an idea of if people are willing to click through on something. Because decide on what you're going to do. If you're going into it thinking that you're going to make a podcast and people who have never heard of your company are going to be all excited about it, that's a pretty tough sell. You better have some kind of, in that situation, remember that you're going to compete against National Public Radio. Like your stuff better be either amazing or some kind of content that nobody can get anywhere else, which is, you look at any TV show, right? If some TV show puts out a podcast about their show and they have the inside view, like nobody else can do that. So that is someplace you'd like to go. If you're in a space where you have 5 competitors that also sell similar products, doing a podcast about, mortgage opportunities, not too many people are going to reach out and want to hear that on the weekend. That's not going to happen.
I certainly don't want to listen to that. But to your point, The Office did that this past year. And so if you're a fan of The Office, the US version, not the UK version, some of the former actors on the US version started that insider look into The Office. So, I mean, that's a really good point. Like, unless you have that unique point of view, or you're planning on just having like guest after guest after guest and subject matter expert, then you really need to consider what is the goal of having the podcast. So let's say you've decided, okay, maybe I don't need to have a podcast right now, but I want to go ahead and sponsor a podcast or advertise a podcast. And we'll play out the other scenario of like, you have a podcast, how do you get advertisers? Because I know that's a big question, but let's say you want to go ahead and sponsor a podcast. Where do you start? Like, do you just reach out to someone and say, hey, I have some money. Do you want to take it?
Yeah. That's a great question, because there's really 2 camps of podcast advertisers that are out there. At one end of the spectrum are these large companies that are already doing advertising in other channels. And in fact, when we see them most often, they already have an agency and they're like, okay, we're doing some TV and radio. We'd like to add podcasts to the mix. And so, you're usually dealing with an agency who already has a stable of podcasts that they like. They kind of are looking for certain numbers. And that's like the classic TV advertising, model, and that those people are looking for tonnage. They want to pay like 20 to 40 bucks 1,000. And so your podcast better show up with, 100,000 listeners if you really want to be able to live off that kind of money. And even at 100,000, it's not even clear if you're going to live. Like you'd be better off shooting for the millions. And then at the other end of the spectrum, which is the more interesting thing, as far as I'm concerned, is the partnership venue where, a podcast may only be 500 people or even 100 people, but those are totally the people that are magic prospects for you. Like if there's a podcast about Learjets, privately owned Learjets, if that podcast only has 30 listeners, if you're a Learjet company, if you're selling private jets, you will pay a ton of money just to get to those 30 people. And that was kind of, so with Marketing Over Coffee, when we started, even when we had, only 3,000 or 4,000 listeners, we had HubSpot was a great partner with us, and they were excited to do business with us because they knew that the lifetime value of their customers was, over $1,500. And so they're more than willing to pay, $700, $800, $1,000 for a lead. So even though, again, even with only $3,000 or $4,000, 3,000 or 4,000 listeners, you can still get a $4,000 or $5,000 sponsorship for 10 shows because those people are buying leads and buying into that highly qualified community. And so it's a very different, two different things. Really at the one end, it's kind of like, we're selling to a super niche group and we're only talking about products that we already trust and know are reputable and good. And we're making a personal endorsement to our small group of fans. And then at the other end is just, you're selling beer, cigarettes, whatever to, the masses, and you just want to get that pure tonnage. So it's two totally different things. And so as an advertiser, you need to think about that. What are you doing? Are you looking to find that small, rabid, passionate fan base, or are you just trying to get out in front of most of the world as fast as you can?
I think that's a really good point. And that was a question that I was going to ask you was, as a podcast, as the person running the podcast, do you feel like you have to have a certain number of listeners or a certain number of downloads per episode in order to attract advertisers? Or does it really, depend on who your audience is and the kind of advertiser you're looking for? And it sounds like the answer is it really depends. So if, for example, we have 200 downloads an episode for the Trust Insights podcast, that might be okay if it's 200 of the exact right B2B marketers that someone like HubSpot, for example, would want to advertise to.
Yeah, exactly. An example of that is, for a long time, I did the Stack and Flow podcast with Sean Zinsmeister. And I was like, okay, so maybe there's 400, 500 listeners, but these are people that have 20 to 30 SaaS, products in their marketing tech stack. This is a very laser focused group of people that spend a lot of money on software tools. So it's an attractive niche. And so what you'll find is if you're in that, niche thing, it's pretty easy to introduce yourself to the major players. You'll know who should be sponsoring you, and odds are they're going to be watching you and knowing you, and it's going to be pretty easy to get that introduction. At the other end, it's pretty much tonnage. Like if you don't have more than 10,000, 15,000 downloads, there comes a point where it's not worth the agency's time to deal with you. It's too much overhead for them to give you the creative, make sure you're running on the weeks you're going to run it, verify that it's good, all that stuff. And if it's only 10,000, listeners you're going to deliver, they're just better off going to, Joe Rogan, where they can buy them at $1 million at a time, millions at a time. And, for the same work, get 100x the just raw tonnage through.
So let me ask you this question, because I think we need to step back a little bit. So you started Marketing Over Coffee before social media was really sort of like the big thing. So like you couldn't necessarily organically post on, to your Facebook followers or your Twitter followers. And, maybe I have my timelines wrong, but you can say, hey, Chris and I, who are well known in the industry, suddenly have a podcast, come listen to it. How does someone advertise their podcast even to start before they can even attract sponsors? Let's talk a little bit about organic advertising to get people to even know that you have a podcast, at all.
That's a really tough question. There's not, most of the getting your podcast to grow stuff is still kind of in this sort of shifty organic thing of, you can go buy to get 500 downloads and try and trick the Apple store to list you on their new and notable and up and coming. And a lot of that is hand curated too. So there's no easy recipe to just kind of explode out the door. Well, the easy recipe would be already have 50,000 followers and tell them about your new podcast when it drops. But if you're building it from the ground up, yeah, it's very difficult because, you can try some paid ads, you can advertise for marketing podcast on Google or something like that to try and get some action. But discovery for podcasts is very difficult. A lot of it is organic. Stuff gets recommended. And that's, we do have kind of a flywheel going in that we've been around long enough. And it's not even like I can't break through on organic for marketing podcasts because there's like 10 or 20. These are the top 20 marketing podcast posts that dominate the organic results. So now it's just the fact that we've been around long enough to make it on a bunch of those lists. We do get the benefit of that. But yeah, I don't have any, if I had an easy map to get 1 million listeners, we'd already be there. So there's we've relied almost exclusively on organic to get in there because there's really no other way to do it.
When you and Chris started the podcast, how did you start to build that listener base?
Yeah, at that time there were so few marketing podcasts that it was really the organic spread was enough. We had the website and we would talk about unique topics. That's always doing good SEO on the shows as far as making sure all the relevant topics and vendors, tagging relevant vendors is another way to get things going. And then the email newsletter is kind of one of the secrets to success for the show. It doesn't bring in new listeners, but it does lock in the existing listeners. And that actually drives a lot of value for the advertisers. The quarterly advertisers realize that, yeah, you're getting all the shows, but the big win is getting in the monthly newsletter that goes along with the show, because that's where we actually push the links where it's right in front of somebody. We can talk about a link on the show, but really there's no reason for somebody to go to the show notes page if they've just downloaded the podcast to their mobile device and are listening. So by getting permission to then email them every month where we can push the links, that's where, the email comes in. They're like, oh yeah, we've been talking about this, let me go see what Upfluence has going on. And they can click through. And so, yeah, a lot of our partners realize that they get predictable clicks from having that monthly newsletter go out.
So now that you guys, and I think Marketing Over Coffee is a great, example to sort of pick apart in terms of all the different, phases of digital marketing that we've been through. Now that you guys have been around for so long and are so well established, what are your tactics these days for attracting advertisers? Like, do you have a big old, sponsor me now button on your website? Are you constantly like reminding all of your Twitter followers, like, hey, you can sponsor us, like, so give us some money? Like, how does Marketing Over Coffee go about finding sponsors these days?
Yeah, there's not a ton of outbound, unfortunately, it's kind of like a chicken and egg thing. It's like if you have to go and tell a sponsor that your podcast is a big deal, you're probably not a big deal. So, that's kind of a challenge is, when people are looking, they're going to come up with a list of the shows that they think are relevant and where they want to be. And we're actually trying a little bit of that right now because there's been such a surge in podcasting that we have like the In-Ear Insights podcast and, Nick Westergaard's On Brand. These are very similar casts that we like, and trying to say to people, well, look, if Marketing Over Coffee is too much for your budget, consider these other casts that have very relevant audiences and might be a fit for you. So that's really the only kind of outbound thing that we've been trying, is to continue to upsell and broaden the catalog. But yeah, really the thing that's always worked for us is the tight fit. I mean, we talk about SEO tools virtually every week. So it's just
Mhm.
a no-brainer that Hrefs would, talk to us because our communities just overlap so much. And same deal with email service providers. And it's a little bit different for us because we're going to talk about those tools every week anyway. So if there's a sponsor there that we can, feature, that
Mhm.
really fits well with the content and does provide value to the listener. It's not like, oh, hey, we just talked for 20 minutes about search. By the way, have you tried Prince spaghetti sauce? That just doesn't, that's kind of jarring and doesn't really provide a ton of value. I mean, yeah, there might be a small group of people that know it's Wednesday and they need some Prince spaghetti.
Yesterday.
But I think that's a Metro Boston thing
I
mostly.
think so.
But it's true. It's just true. It's the fact that it's relevant. And we see this too, in that the sponsors always want us to do a read.
Yeah.
It's not like we pause and we run 60 seconds of some voiceover talking about, buy it today. And in fact, that's part of the marketing over coffee thing. We always try and work it really tight into the content to be like, oh, well, since we're talking about Kardashians, have you looked at Upfluence to find influencers in your audience? It's by making those transitions, we bring the listener along with us. Because it's just a funny thing in that we really start answering to two masters. We need the content always needs to be relevant. We always talk about educate and entertain. That's the goal.
Mhm.
So we want to keep the audience educated and entertained. But at the same time, once you take on a sponsor, you're agreeing to help grow their business. That's really what it is. You're not just selling a 60-second spot. You are, a marketing program, and you're going to try and help them get some more money on the table.
So, what are some of the biggest mistakes that advertisers make when they're trying to sponsor a podcast or when they're looking, so just walk me through like some of the do's and don'ts.
Yeah, that's a good question because there's some mistakes that people make when they show up, when they first come in. And the biggest one is not understanding the nature of how podcasting works and that it's a time-shifted medium. And so a lot of digital marketers will show up and they're expecting the same thing with their Facebook and Google ads. They're like, okay, the ad dropped today. How many clicks did we get? And, they're expecting to get all the action within 3 days because
Mhm.
pretty much, email, ad channels, so many digital channels. After that third day, I mean, the half-life is like 4 hours after the drop, right? It's like
Mhm.
by the 5th day, you're not expecting to get anything at all on that thing. You're considering it dead. You're moving on. Whereas with a podcast, one episode, it can take 6 weeks for the downloads to peak. So even though it goes out today, there's still people who, once a month sync their iPhone up to grab their podcasts. And there's people that binge, they sit down and then they'll listen to 3 or 4 episodes in a row. Well, you have to keep in mind that, the oldest one in there then is 3 weeks. So, you're getting action. We typically see that with a sponsorship that it's around 6 or 7 weeks where stuff starts to finally peak and that they're getting the clicks because people finally do that listen. And I've constantly subscribed to that idea that, you can't just sponsor one show and think that you're going to get any action. People need to hear it like 5 or 6 times and then they start to have some recall and think about, how that thing fits. And that's just like a general goal too. Yeah, I wouldn't throw your whole budget. It's not like a Super Bowl ad. You don't throw everything on advertising on one podcast for $500,000. You'd be far better off finding 5 podcasts where the audience are a dead match and sponsor them for a year. Because you just stay in front. Because a lot of these things too, the listener can, it doesn't matter how awesome your marketing automation system is. If our listener is 3 months in their annual subscription, there's no chance they're doing anything for 8 months, and so by you showing up every week, staying in front of them when that renewal period comes by, they're like, oh yeah, I do need to check these guys, even if it's just to get a better price to beat my existing vendor. Then it becomes a thing. So, but yeah, not paying attention to that time shifting nature and not considering it an evergreen program because, and so this is another thing too. The smarter advertisers will come to us and earmark specific shows. They'll be asking like, okay, we know you do marketing in tech, but how many shows are you going to do on email marketing, this quarter? Can I see the content calendar? And we do have the content calendar because there's certain topics we want to hit every quarter because they're constantly changing and the audience wants to hear about them. And then, the smartest ones too, and this is a thing you find is, it's the niche folks already know the show. They're going to say, oh, hey, when's Seth Godin going to be on next? We want to sponsor that episode because, and the fact is, an episode like that is going to pull twice as many downloads. I mean, we'll average 11, 12K downloads per show, but Seth Godin can pull 20,000 downloads because, that content just goes farther. And we have his amazing audience to draft off of. And that's another thing too. We drift a little bit over to the podcaster side, but when you have Seth Godin on your podcast, you run Facebook ads that target the Seth Godin audience. He has people who follow him and are always looking for him. And so if you're interviewing him this week, you go throw $100 against that. And I'm totally giving away the secrets. That's like an outbound thing that you actually can't do. You get a great guest and then you target them. And there's other secrets too, but we'll save those for folks that want to know more or ask questions in the aisle, because there are some other things you can do to make sure you're in front of the right people at the right time.
So let's talk a little bit about measurement. So let's say I'm a podcast sponsor and I come to Marketing Over Coffee and I say, here's my $10,000. How do I, as a sponsor, know that my money did anything? What are some of the common, mistakes that sponsors forget to do, or that podcast hosts don't know to have those sponsors provide to them so that they can measure the success?
Yeah. And then, this is another thing that goes with us. It's because we do this kind of stuff all the time and we understand who's buying from us, we're fine coaching them too. And it's look, we're not going to run your ad unless you have a trackable link. You got to give me a trackable link to put in your show notes. Other shows will just be like, yeah, give me your, myhomepage.com and just throw that on there and they're fine and they don't care. But it's no, do, myhomepage.moc so you can see how many clicks you get from Marketing Over Coffee and how much traffic gets driven there. So trackable link is it. And then there is unfortunately, there's still a huge gap in podcasting. You can't, we can't track how far into a show people go and things like that. There's a lot of dynamics that aren't there that you can see with the web, but there's a couple things that, we do have the engagement. The one thing with podcasting is if somebody subscribes to a podcast and they don't download, I think it's for 3 weeks from Apple, it will actually stop downloading automatically. So that's a 1 month recency for us because we're a weekly show. If somebody doesn't download it all this month, they're already not in the numbers for the next month. So when you see our download numbers, that they're they've got a good recency. And then, it's, use download numbers as a measuring stick to try and get an idea, but it really doesn't matter. It's all about how many, clicks do you get to that trackable link and what do you actually see in the pipeline too? Because that's the thing, have your sales guys as leads come in. Hey, how'd you hear about us? Where did you come from? We have a lot of, the one thing that's cool with us that works well is that, the people buying from us are also the audience. So I've had more than one CMO be like, oh yeah, the CMO of Slack told me about your cast. And so, that there's no way we can buy that or make that happen. That's how organic works for us. So you kind of measure that awareness, but we do see that with a lot of sponsors. Well, they'll sponsor for a quarter or two, and then they kind of go away for a year. And then they come back and they're like, okay, every year we hear about, we realize that 5 or 6 of these deals come in from people that have heard this on the podcast. And we know, maybe if we, are in this show this week, it's not going to bring in 5 deals in the next 3 months, but it will bring in 5 deals over the next 2 years. And so they know it's, the right kind of place to be. Oh, another one on that front too, is don't be afraid as an advertiser. If you're going to make a serious contribution, don't be afraid to ask for input on the content calendar. Now, every show it's going to be subject to editorial review, but still, in our case, we're going to cover SEO tools no matter what. So if we have to pick, a customer or case study out there and you're a sponsor for the show, you should say, look at me first. I mean, if you're going to run a show about SEO, at least give us the fair shake of talk to our executives and our customers before you just go to Joe Vendor down the street who's not helping support this whole community. And we're totally, we totally understand that too. It's if a company is going to put its hard-earned marketing budget into marketing over coffee so that we can keep doing the show for free for everybody, like that deserves the respect of, just asking for their expertise and getting a chance to talk about what they do best.
What other kinds of metrics so let's say, I want to attract sponsors for the In-Ear Insights podcast, our Trust Insights podcast. What other metrics besides, episode downloads should I be thinking about in order to attract sponsors? Do the sponsors care about how many Twitter followers I have or how many people are on my email list? And are those metrics that I should lead with if I'm trying to find an advertiser?
Yeah, you can definitely put those out there. I mean, and then it would be one thing. You wouldn't just say like, we get X number of downloads. It's like, okay, we get X number of downloads and it gets put in our social channel and we've got this many followers on these social channels and we mail and we get that many thousand. Because when you get to the point where people are concerned about tonnage, those are valid numbers. I mean, obviously the social media, Twitter and Instagram numbers aren't as strong as the folks who are listening to your voice for a half hour. Like those folks are totally vested. Whereas, a tweet or a post may just flow through the stream or you're measuring likes or clicks. But yeah, showcase on all channels. There's definitely, benefit to doing that and seeing what's going on there. And then the other one is try to, again, ultimately you're trying to drive business for that sponsor. So having a prospective sponsor on as a guest is a thing to do. If you want to cover a topic this week and you realize that, hey, this company is the best one to talk about this. If you talk to an exec from that company, and if they notice that they get some pass through, that people were actually talking about them being on the show, and especially that's a good way to do it. Because so you ask them to be a guest, and then you see if they promote it on social and if they get a lift, because then you can say, okay, yeah, these people do understand how to promote stuff and how to make it work, and they'll be able to measure if your show actually moved the needle for them. And hopefully they just come back to you because they're like, yeah, we got on once and we got a lot of heat from that show. So why don't we make this a regular thing?
So what are some of the more common mistakes that a podcast host can make in the context of podcast advertising?
Yeah, for the host, it is, the biggest one is just kind of that the hubris of like, oh, you're lucky we're giving you the 30-second spot. It's just like, thanks for your money, but we'll put it on there. Like, it just kills me. A lot of times once, as we're able to do more of these now as agency presentations, because we have enough numbers to attract larger vendors. And for a podcaster to like show up late to the kickoff meeting and not have read the script already and maybe have a few well thought out questions for the agency about what are you trying to do and where are you going. And, you've got to treat your sponsors as your customers and that you're trying to help them grow their business. And the more you can make their program effective and talk reliably and confidently about what they do and who they are, because ultimately what'll happen is, especially in these big agency ones, is they have a pool of money. They're going to pick a ton of shows. And then 3-4 months later, they're going to go back and look and say, okay, which were the best ones to work with? Those are the ones that are going to get the annual contracts, or we're going to continue to work with, because there will be a culling. They're going to start with 10 shows and they're going to realize that, yeah, these 7 don't really seem to move the needle. The audience isn't in line with what we want to do, or we think the host is a jerk, whatever. But there's going to be some that get thrown off. And if you're one of the ones that is helping, meet their quarterly and annual goals, you're going to stay on the list.
So we've run the gamut in terms of talking about what advertisers should be looking for in terms of, if they want to sponsor. We've talked about, if you own the podcast, if you host the podcast, what you should be doing. Is there any other things that we should be considering if, we want to attract advertisers to our podcast? And I'm using sort of the we in general, like any podcast.
Yeah, I think, one way to think about it is like, okay, if, a company was going to create audio content, would it be our show? So for In-Ear Insights, it's just classic that it's, marketing and analytics are huge. So Google would want In-Ear Insights as a podcast, in their stable of shows, because it's just every week you guys are talking about interesting analytics stuff on the marketing front. And oh, by the way, it all happens to be driven by Google.
Do you hear that, Google?
I know, Google, are you there? See, this is the problem. It's kind of tough to get a human on the phone at Google when you're, trying to bang through the door. You're much better off if you know somebody there, and even then, it's a little bit challenging. But that's the lens that you need to look at it through. Is kind of like who would we be a marketing program for? Like if a company was just going to go ahead and start doing this, because, and you can even go and look. I don't know. This is a little challenging whether you poke or not. But you can find companies that have had a marketing podcast that died that are in your vertical. Basically, you want to look at LinkedIn, you look at the marketing director as CMO, and you make sure that it's a new one since before the podcast died. Because you don't want to go and be in there like, hey, I heard you did a sucky podcast, like that's totally going to tank. But you can be like, oh, yeah, the guy before you did a podcast. Damn, that was stupid. You should be advertising. And that will work. So yeah, that's kind of a way to get in there and think about, what itch you scratch for that customer.
I feel like we have our work cut out for us to get advertisers for our podcast. So, we have Inner Insights, we have Marketing Over Coffee, we have this live stream. We're always looking for people who want to, get a piece of it. But, in general, John, any final thoughts? Or we never really talk about where can people find Marketing Over Coffee? Like there's marketingovercoffee.com, correct?
Yeah. But then, most people are discovering us through Stitcher or Spotify or Apple Podcasts. They don't come direct. And then there's very, in relative terms, the website gets very little traffic. It's not something that I'm trying to think, it's a big month with like 3,000 visitors a month, but we'll get 11,000 shows downloaded per episode. So that's, we're doing over 70,000 downloads a month for the podcast. So at 30, that's not, yeah. So, I mean, the the website's just slightly ahead of the number of downloads, but the website is a 2-second page view, and one download of the podcast is 40 minutes of content or 20 minutes of content, depending on the show. So it's actually offset on a magnitude basis. But the one thing, a big thing to keep in mind with this, if you don't have advertising as the sole goal for the thing, because the secret and the hidden thing here is that it's actually a marketing program for us. We have a community now of people that are into marketing and analytics. And because they listen to the podcasts, now later on when they have questions, they come to us. They're leads for Trust Insights. All of the podcasts we have are actually all great marketing programs for Trust Insights, because this is the audience that has these kinds of problems, and the things that we solve are part of what we do at Trust Insights. So it's, if the listeners of the podcast have problems that can be answered by what your company does, you don't need to have as much advertising revenue, because if it's just going to generate inbound customers, there's huge value to that. And you're really kind of cutting out the middleman. It's more benefit, direct to you as a company.
Well, and it's interesting. I always kind of get a chuckle every time I see someone join our Slack group, which is Analytics for Marketers. The first thing people often say is, I've been listening to Marketing Over Coffee for the past decade, or, I'm so excited to be in this community with Chris and John. And that's one of the benefits is, in some ways, they get direct access to the people they've been listening to for a very long time, which is definitely a unique thing that we offer with our Analytics for Marketers Slack group, is that you and Chris, in your own respect, are those podcast celebrities. You've been doing it forever. People know the voice, and now they actually get to talk to the person doing the podcast. So, I think that's a really cool experience for people.
Yeah, and that's another, we've been talking a lot about from an advertising angle, and that is very mercenary. It's like we're here to make the money and get the leads. But the reality is, like, it still is artistic. As far as art, it's about marketing and tech. So it's not the most, we're not going to compete with Ted Lasso or other TV shows, but, it's something that people do look for entertainment for. They kind of go out every week, and we float this thing out every week. And we know half of them are going to be worse than the average show. That's just the way it works. You never know what you're going to get. There's some risk and art and excitement there. And and the best part is it's a community of people that kind of all have the same types of problems. We joked that the whole reason we did this was because, nobody wants to hear our stories at Thanksgiving. We have to tell these stories to other marketers because our family doesn't want to hear about this. And it's exciting to other marketers. We can geek out over open rates and click rates and stuff like that. And nobody else wants to hear that. So part of the secret.
That's a really good point. So, John, we've been talking about podcast advertising for the past 40-ish minutes or so. Any final thoughts or any sort of like actions that you want to leave the audience with of like, if you have a podcast, go do this?
Keep doing what you're doing. Always hone your art. I think as a podcaster, the big thing is remember you're competing against, Joe Rogan and National Public Radio. And, it's not, you're not competing against the 4 other vendors who've bailed on a podcast. Make the best show you can, but come at it from that artistic side. If you feel you have something to say, go out there and say it, because, there might be somebody that really wants to hear that, and you could get a chance to create a new community and make some new connections. So, if you've got it in your heart, then definitely go and do it. It doesn't have to be driven by the books. Now, if you get beaten every quarter about your numbers, think long and hard about this and don't get wrapped into it. But, but if you feel you want to do it and have got to do it, definitely make your voice heard.
Well, smart advice from one of the world's oldest podcasters.
World's oldest. That's a good. I like that. World's old. It's old. We've been podcasting forever.
Well, you know what, John? We will be here same time next week talking about something else having to do with marketing. Maybe it's benchmarking. Maybe it's SEO. Who knows? So tune in next week, next Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern, and we will see you then.
That sounds good. marketingovercoffee.com. We'll see you there.
Thanks for watching today. Be sure to subscribe to our show wherever you're watching it. For more resources and to learn more, check out the Trust Insights podcast at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast and our weekly email newsletter at trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Got questions about what you saw in today's episode? Join our free Analytics for Marketers Slack group at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. See you next time.